Okay, looking at the Type 1 Beetle case, going to remove this, all the fasteners from this, and started into the process of machining one. Actually, I didn't have to do any machining on the bottom end. The bores are in really good shape here. They're all standard bores, which is a great place to start. I'm going to upsize this engine from a 1598 or a 1600cc engine to a 2276. So in order to do that, I have to go oversize with the crankshaft and put quite a bit of a larger crankshaft into it. So there's a lot of spacing that needs to be cut on this and a lot of time that gets spent in the case to be able to allow material to be relieved so that the crank webs, or pardon me, the counterweights and connecting rods can bypass these certain points. So right here, these are relieves cut in the case on both sides, and you can see on the top here, I've cut that down, cut this down. I mean, they're not entirely symmetrical, but I've made them fit based on the movement of the connecting rods. And down in this area here, this is kind of cut in a concaved sort of pattern to allow for that crank counterweight to spin past this particular point. I've had to cut up into here to relieve for a connecting rod swinging by the one of the cam bores, bearing bores. Other points is taking the webs out of the side here so that the crank counterweight can swing by here, because the crankshaft that I'm using is a fully counterweighted crankshaft. Again, that's going to allow me to spin up high in RPMs and of course change the stroke. Other things that I'm doing on the block is I've removed the plugs, the gallery plugs. There's an example of one right there. Drilled a hole in it. Took a little grinder and removed some of the material, some of the casting material that gets formed over top of these plugs when they're originally casted. So I've tooled this down a bit too, and tooled this portion down a little bit so that when I tap this out, I think it's a 3/8 pipe tap that it gets tapped out to, then that allows my engine oil pressure to come back into this particular point. So this gallery here gets plugged for the oil pump, and it gets routed outside of the pump through a cooler, through a filter or filtration system, and then back into here, and then that supplies the main galleries. Now the other one I've taken out also here is the main rifle gallery, and you can see here this rifle is what's going to supply the lifters and then out towards the crankshaft for lubrication. So Volkswagens are a little different the way they're lubricated. They bring the oil pressure out of the hole, and then it goes around the outside of the bearing and then into holes to supply the lube between the bearing and the crankshaft to give you that wedge of oil that's needed in there in the vertical oil clearance. So the other thing that I've done here also is I've had the heads machined for this particular purpose. The block's already been done. I've opened it up. I opened this up myself with 94 millimeter boring tool, and then you can probably see in the video that I've cut right into the case savers, and now I have a step in here, and this step is cut. I can't remember exactly what the machine shop cut it to, because I had them recut these spigots, and that gets it nice and flat, and then I can put a shim in there to readjust and reposition my deck height of my piston so that it can help me control my compression ratio. The other thing that I want to look at based on compression ratio is the cylinder heads that I have. These ones were a little bit of a bigger cylinder head to begin with, having 42 millimeter intake valves and 35.5 exhaust. And the heads have now been cut out to 94 millimeter for 94 millimeter jugs. And I have a nice new fresh step that I had cut on here to allow me to seal that new cylinder, or that new sleeve, to this particular bore. And you can see how much bigger it's gone now because I'm actually into the holes. Now this case here is using the 8 millimeter studs, which gives me lots of wiggle room, and I'll have to make some adjustments on the holes that go directly through the cylinders into the block, and that's what's going to hold them in position. So with these ones now, once I do a CC value of this, once I put the new valves in, and it's going stainless steel valves with high rev springs, and then I'll do a CC value on here, and then I can readjust my bowl configuration. I've already unshrouded these considerably, done a little bit of porting on them, did some gasket matching porting prior to it going to the machine shop, and this way it's a good start with some of the material being removed. And then I'll reassemble them once the valves are in. Then I can do a CC video on how to calculate the CC and the volume that's being calculated from that particular point. So I'll continue on with some other videos. And this is the build for a 2276 CC VW engine.